Hello? Hello? Yep.
Okay. Good evening, everybody. My goodness, this was to be a small history talk. Thank you so much for coming tonight. I am just overwhelmed by the number of people here tonight, and thank you for your support this evening. I know some people have travelled quite a distance tonight, so a very warm welcome to Dungannon, to anyone who has come from afar. And apologies, we can't use our halls tonight because we're in full renovation out in our other halls, and where there's white dust everywhere. We did try to clean, but it's just impossible. So we decided to move it into the church, and just as well we did, to be honest with you. So I hope that you'll feel at home with us this evening. Just a few housekeeping rules. There's no fire practices planned for this evening, but a bit like the ladies on the airplanes, the fire exits are there and here. So, and during supper, the fire exits again will be just out through the main church doors. And the assembly point is at Iceland Supermarket, which, for those who don't know, is just straight across the road and down into the car park, really. So hopefully we'll not have any need to use those. The toilets, again, they're under renovation at the minute, but there is a gents and a ladies, so just out through the door, and some of the folk here will show you where to go through the arch. Now, as you may know, and hopefully everybody got a wee leaflet, we are having a Remembrance Weekend between the 7th and the 9th of November, and it's called Sacrifice Remembered. And it's going to take the form, this church is going to be completely transformed into displays about both wars and about the Troubles and so forth, depicting many aspects of the war and of the service and those who made the ultimate sacrifice during the war. The name of the event is Sacrifice Remembered, and that's very deliberate because there's also a very important spiritual side to the displays, and every display will have a spiritual side where we will be remembering the sacrifice that God made for us. So in a few weeks, as we walk around those displays, we might recognise one or two names. We may look at the memorials here and sort of look at those names and remember someone, or we may have someone from our own family who fought in the war. But the First World War was 105 years ago. The living memories of those who took part in that war, those are gone, more or less. The Second World War ended 80 years ago. So folk who actively served in the war, they're sadly few and far between, and anyone who has those memories were mostly children during the war. So, sorry. Can everybody hear? Okay, that's the most important thing. Yes, good, thank you. So in every church, you will see memorials, as we have over here, to those who served and died in the Great War and the Second World War. And I'm a bit of a history buff, so I do sometimes read the names on there, and I wonder often what stories lie behind the men and women who are on those memorials. In our particular memorial, those were all people who belonged to our congregation, and they sat in the pews that you're sitting in now. And while I don't know a lot of them, I do know one, and that was John Charles William Simpson. Very familiar to me. And I know John's name for several reasons. I'm not related to him in any way, but firstly, when my late mother talked about the war, the conversation would always come round to John Simpson. And John's family owned a Tyrone Courier newspaper, where she worked in the office in the mid-1940s before she was married. And both her family and the Simpson family came to this church, so they knew each other. She was only a few years younger than John, and when she spoke about the war, she always mentioned John Simpson joining the RAF and being a prisoner of war, but she really didn't know much about the details of anything more than that. But what stuck in my memory was she used to say that when John came back safely from the war, the whole community and the church were overjoyed that he was safe. And she always said it was like your own brother coming home, which that memory just stayed with me. And I also got to know John Simpson, or Mr. Simpson, as I called him. I do feel a bit odd calling him John through this presentation, but Mr. Simpson, my then-to-be husband, worked in the Tyrone Courier office as a reporter for many years, so I got to know the Simpsons at various events. And then I worked in the office in the Courier over the summer months as well, so again, I was very familiar with Mr. Simpson and Peter. And it was a great place to work, and they were great employees, very happy place to work. And then I also realised when I was doing some work on the history of the church that the Simpson family had a very long connection with this church, going back about 150 years, because John's grandfather, the Reverend Robert Taylor Simpson, was the third minister of Second Dungannon Presbyterian Church, and he was ordained there on Sunday the 23rd of September 1878. Now, this is a drawing of the original Presbyterian church that you are sitting in now in Scott Street, and that was built around 1728 before the transepts and the tower and the stonework was put on in the 1800s. And up until 1823, there was only one Presbyterian church in the town. But there was a wee bit of tension. Tony will say there was more than a wee bit of tension in Scotland, just about liberalism with ministers preaching, and that tension then spread to Ireland as well and made its way to Dungannon. And there was tensions in the church, so a breakaway group from this church decided they would set up another church in 1823. And they got a church in John Street, just down the street here, and they had a church and they had a manse on the same street. And that church was called Second Dungannon Presbyterian Church. And as I said, in 1878, the Reverend Robert Taylor Simpson was appointed as the third minister of that church. He was a native of Newtownards. He served in Corvally Presbyterian in County Monaghan for 6 years, and then he came here to Dungannon, and he was here for 36 years. Now, the handy thing about being in church is you can actually see their memorials over here. These two marble memorials were moved from 2nd Dungannon Presbyterian when it closed in 1928, and one is for Mrs. Simpson, who died in 1898, and the other for the Reverend Robert Taylor Simpson, and he died in 1914. Now, the Reverend Simpson and his wife had at least 5 children that I can find, but I do know they lost several children to TB. But one of their sons who survived was John Charles Simpson, and he was born in 1875. John Charles was a very prominent man in the church and in the local business community. He bought the local paper, the Dungannon News Tyrone Courier. He merged the two of them, and therefore was very well known in the community as a businessman. Whenever 2nd Dungannon closed in 1928, the family moved into 1st Dungannon, and John Simpson was very active. He was an elder, he was in the committee and so forth, very active in this church. He was also a Sunday school teacher. So you will see here, there's a stained glass window between the two memorials, and when John Charles Simpson died in 1944, his family installed this stained glass window between the two Simpson memorials, and it was dedicated to their father and their mother, John Charles Simpson, and his wife, Sarah Simpson. Now, John and Sarah, they had 6 children, 2 sons and 4 daughters. And we're again going to look at one of those, because that's the man we're going to talk about tonight, John Charles William Simpson. He's a namesake for his father. So some of you may well remember John, as he is in this slide. And Mr. and Mrs. John Simpson were members of the church, and again, owners of the Tyrone Courier newspaper. John was born the 3rd of January 1923. He was educated at the Royal School, and he loved sport. He was vice-captain of the school rugby team and a keen member of the cricket team. But when John was about 16 years of age, that normality of life was shattered when the outbreak of World War II was announced on the 3rd of September 1939. So John made his way in the autumn of 1940 down to Belfast to a Clifton Street recruiting office, where he signed up for the Royal Air Force with the intention of becoming a pilot in the RAF. That was his ambition. But like all recruits, John had to attend a medical, which he passed with flying colours, except for his eyesight, which was not 100%. And because of his eyesight, he was offered a job as ground crew. John politely refused the ground crew job. And then the medical officer, seeing John's determination, took a second look at his eyes and just passed him with the bare minimum. So John got into the RAF, and we'll see later why that detail is very important. So from Belfast, he boarded a boat and he sailed to Heysham and then to Padgate Receiving Centre. John was now an RAF trainee, his service number 117426. Padgate Receiving Centre was a Royal Air Force station in Lancashire near Warrington. It was a basic training centre for RAF recruits, particularly those destined for aircrew positions. During John's medical at Padgate, his eyesight again caused problems, but the doctor passed him, now you love this, on the grounds that John may have had a sore head from the rough sea crossing coming back across. So he skipped through again. And a short time into his training, John got 10 days leave, and he came home to Dungannon and then went back to Padgate, where he got his uniform and his kit. So here we see John in his uniform, looking very smart. From there, John moved from training station to training station. He began basic training in Brighton, where the RAF lads were all known as Irks to the landlords and the landladies who were there. He then moved to RAF Cranwell, which was the world's first air academy, opened in 1920, and today still continues to train the next generation of RAF officers. Now, on arriving at Cranwell, John was very disappointed because instead of being told, now you're going to train to be a pilot, he was sent to the gas centre to work there. And the friends that he went with, one was sent to the fire station, one was sent to the officers' mess, and the other was sent to the transport section. And they were not happy. But anyway, so John's working in the gas centre, and the fear of gas was very real at that time. There were recent memories of the gas attacks in the trenches during World War I, and the possibility of chemical warfare was very real during the war. Now, every Saturday morning, there was a practice gas attack, and the sergeant in the charge of the gas centre liked the way John spoke. He must have had a lovely Tyrone accent. So John got the job of sitting in the back of a gas van. He was swinging a large wooden rattle, blowing a whistle and shouting into a microphone. And if you bear with us, Harry Swan, where's Harry? Harry's going to come up and demonstrate exactly what this commotion would have sounded like. Now, this is not rehearsed, so just go with us. So, Harry, there's your rattle. You need to give that. You know how to use that? Right, swing it round, and there's your whistle. Blow that. So you're in the back of the van, and swing your rattle. Gas attack! Keep going, Harry. Gas attack! Gas attack! Wear your gas mask! Gas attack! Gas attack! Wear your gas mask! Well done, Harry. Thank you, Harry. So that was John's job. Everybody immediately had to put on their gas mask, and anybody who forgot their gas mask or didn't wear it was actually put on a charge. It was so important. Now, there happened one day, one particular Saturday morning, that the station commander, Air Commodore Harold Probyn, came to inspect the gas centre because he wanted to see how the practices were going. Now, Probyn was a real character. We could spend the evening talking about him. He met the Wright brothers when he was 12, which began a fascination with aeroplanes. He was a pilot in World War I, flying frequently over the Somme. He served in World War II in senior posts, and he retired to Kenya, where he celebrated his 90th birthday by flying solo in an aeroplane that he built himself. Legend has it, it was powered by the Volkswagen engine from his wife's car. But anyway, so back to John. John's in the van, and the gas is going, the gas attack practice is going. He set off as usual, and Air Commodore Probyn was coming behind him in his car. All went well. Then 2 days later, word came through that Air Commodore Probyn would like to see Aircraftman Second Class John Simpson, and he was to report to headquarters immediately. And of course, nobody knew, had John done something wrong? Had he done something right? What had happened? But it turned out that Air Commodore Probyn wanted to know why John was not training to be a pilot. Why was he in the gas centre? John wondered this himself, but he didn't dare say anything to Air Commodore Probyn. But the Commodore said he would sort it immediately, and he was true to his word, and a few days later, word came through that John was being posted to the initial training centre in Leuchars in Scotland, which is about 5 miles away from St Andrews on the northeast coast. Now, Leuchars was a crucial coastal command station, primarily involved in maritime patrols, anti-submarine and anti-shipping operations. At Leuchars, John was trained in navigation, in aircraft recognition, wireless telegraphy and Morse code operation by lamp and by wireless. And a feature of Leuchars training camp was that the RAF trainees could stand at the end of the runway and thumb a lift from an aeroplane that was about to take off. And so it was one day that John was waiting at the end of the runway with his thumb high in the air to show that he wanted a lift, and a Dutch crew training in Lockheed Hudson's stopped and told him to get in. This was John's first time in an aircraft, and he was just settling in, feeling this was very nice and things were lovely. Yes, this was grand. And the aircraft climbed to about 3,000 feet and then suddenly went into a nosedive. And John went into a panic. They were going to crash. But then there was a tremendous racketing from the plane as well, and frightened the life out of John until he realised that the rear gunner had opened up with a machine gun. And he was firing off round after round. And what had actually happened was that the Dutch crew were practising their bombing and shooting skills. There was an outline of a ship painted on the ground, and they were practising hitting this ship. They did the manoeuvre 4 times, and when the exercise was over, poor John stumbled out of the aircraft onto the ground with very wobbly legs, but it was good practice for what lay ahead for him. John's next phase of training was at Aircrew Receiving Centre in Regent's Park in London, where Lord's Cricket Ground was requisitioned by the military, and the pilots were billeted in nearby blocks of flats, and the restaurant was at London Zoo, the canteen there at London Zoo. Several weeks later, he passed all the tests that he had to, and he was delighted when he was officially selected to become a pilot. He was posted to number 14 Elementary Training Flying School at Fair Oaks, and he learned then to fly the de Havilland Tiger Moths. John completed his elementary training on the 24th of October 1941. And at the end of October, at the age of 18, we still remember this lad was so young, he was posted to number 2 Bryce Norton on the edge of the Cotswolds, where he started training then in twin-engined Oxfords. He had his first flight in Oxford on October the 28th, 1941. His instructor was Flying Officer Green, and he flew solo for the first time on December the 7th, 1941. Halfway through the course, John was moved to RAF Lyncham near Bryce Norton, and he joined number 2 Service Flying Training School and finished the training course at the end of March 1942. He was then posted to number 2 Advanced Flying Unit at Wing, very appropriate name, near Leighton Buzzard, where he completed his flying training on Oxford, and most importantly was awarded his wings. So John was now Pilot Officer John Charles William Simpson. You can see his wings just in the photograph, excuse me. Now this meant that John was now in line to be given a commission, which would give him the authority to lead or command other personnel. Remember, he was 19 years of age. He was a bit worried about taking on this responsibility, and he got in contact with his father, John Simpson, but his father told him, go for it. Just, you've trained for it, go for it. So he went for his medical, which he passed with flying colours, except for, you've guessed it, the eyes. And they refused to accept him because of his eyes and said he could not be a pilot in any shape or form. But being as forthright as ever, John went straight to the Chief Medical Officer. He told him that he would get his commission before the medical officer had the forms signed and sent. So after a bit of argy-bargy, the Chief Medical Officer told John he would pass him on one condition, that he must wear goggles every time he was flying. And of course, from that day on, John never put a pair of goggles on when he was flying. So John's next posting then was to beam approach training in Ipswich, where he spent 5 days on Oxford's learning beam approaches. And I think the reason I just want to show you is how much training was done for these lads in such a short time. Now this system, the Beam Approach Beacon System, or BABS for short, was a homing device using radio beacons to help pilots land on the runway in poor visibility, which was a very important skill. And by this time, John had accumulated 173 hours of flying. Next, John was posted to 26 Operational Training Unit at Wing, again, near Leighton Buzzard, and this is where he would start his training on Wellingtons, on the Vickers Wellingtons. The Vickers Wellington was British-made, twin-engined, long-range medium bomber designed in the 1930s at Brooklands in Surrey. Led by the Vickers Armstrong Chief Engineer, Rex Pearson, a key design feature of the Wellington was its geodetic airframe structure, designed by the famous Barnes Wallis, who is so well known for the bouncing bomb of the Dam Busters. Now, a geodetic structure in aircraft is a design using a lattice of interconnected rods, and they sort of form a basket weave in the aeroplane. Barnes Wallis design gave them a lightweight but strong and rigid structure, and most importantly, a damaged aeroplane that was injured or hit with flak could continue flying because the basic basket weave structure held it all together, and hopefully the crew could make it home even with a damaged plane. And this design would prove life-saving for John and his crew. The twin-engined Wellington formed the backbone of Bomber Command during the early years of Second World War and was the most mass-produced aircraft of its time. It was powered by the powerful V12 Rolls-Royce Merlin twin engines and nicknamed the Wimpy after J. Wellington Wimpy, who was a portly, hamburging-loving character from the Popeye cartoons. I don't remember him, but apparently that's who he was named after. The Wellington had a use of ranges. It was a strategic and tactical bomber by day and by night. It could be used by Coastal Command as a means of tracking and destroying U-boats. It was a mine layer, a torpedo bomber, a transport aircraft, and a supply carrier. So a very important piece of machinery in the arsenal. At the time when John qualified as a pilot, the Wellington bombers had to fly on operations without any backup because the RAF fighters didn't have the range to escort them over enemy territory, so they were entirely dependent on their own gunners for protection. There was a gunner in the nose turret, but it was not only dangerous because of enemy flak, but also there was no heat in the turret, so quite often the rear gunner could get, or the nose gunner could get frostbite because it was so cold. There was also a tail gunner with 2 machine guns and 2 beam gun positions to make the aircraft less vulnerable from side attack. So John was stationed at Wing, and it was here he met the crew, who were a mixture of men from all over. So we'll just have a wee look at the crew. So John was from Tyrone. His navigator was Scottish. His wireless operator and air gunners were Canadian, and his front gunner was a Londoner. They had their first flight as a crew on the 23rd of June 1942 in Wellington 908. And in the middle of September 1942, John and his crew were informed that they were going to be posted to number 12 Squadron at Binbrook, which was a very basic airfield and was equipped with Vickers Wellingtons. So John was now part of the famous Bomber Command, which was a force within the RAF that was responsible for laying and dropping mines with the intention of destroying strategic enemy targets. And they flew mostly at night because of the very heavy losses that they sustained during the day early on in the war. So as well as Bomber Command, the RAF had Coastal Command and Fighter Command. Fighter Command was responsible for direct head-to-head war in the air to protect Britain from the Luftwaffe attack. So all those dogfights that you would see in the sky, that was Fighter Command. Bomber Command was known as the Sword because they were flying over enemy territory, they were dropping mines, and they were essentially taking the war to the enemy. Fighter Command was known as the Shield because they were protecting the country. So John was now operational as a pilot officer, and on the evening of the 16th of September 1942, he and his crew took off on their first operation. This was to bomb the Krupp's factories in Essen, Germany. And again, we go back to the fact John was 19 years old. The factories in Essen were a key area for the production of weapons and for steel for the German military, so it was vital to the Allies that the Krupp's factories were taken out. This was John's first operation, so he flew as second dickie to Pilot Officer Morton. They returned safely from that operation, but one of the other Wellingtons was fully armed with incendiaries and it crashed with the loss of all lives. So I'm sure that brought to John just how dangerous. From then on, John flew regular missions. He laid mines in the Frisia Islands off the north coast of Germany. He bombed the city of Aachen, which was also a key city in the Allies' attempts to move forward into the industrial Ruhr Valley in Germany. And again, very important operations for the Allies. Having been transferred to a brand new airfield at Wickenby, John flew on a mission to Osnabrück, which had a very large railway station. It was a major transportation hub for the German army. It had already been bombed by the Allies, but they needed to put this out of operation. And it was also on the direct flight path for the Allied bombers trying to get to Berlin, so it had to be taken out. And of course, when we talk about these missions, it's not just a matter of flying in, doing the job, and flying back out again. When the crews were flying, they were flying over enemy-occupied territory. They were being bombarded with enemy flak from the ground, and they had Luftwaffe in the air as well. And their chances of being killed or injured were very high. So when John's crew returned safely from Osnabrück, they were informed that all of 12 Squadron were going to be re-equipped with the Dream machine, the new 4-engined heavy bomber Lancaster, and they were delighted with that. And the crews were actually stood down until the Lancasters arrived. But on the 7th of October in 1942, a signal came through that 9 aircraft were needed from 12th Squadron to lay mines at St. Nazaire Harbour. Oh, sorry, that's Osnabrück. So, St. Nazaire Harbour. It was a very important German naval base in Normandy. It had already been severely damaged by an Allied attack earlier in the year. But it was a very heavily fortified dock, and it was a safe haven for German U-boats, which were the terror of the seas. It was also home to the battleship Tirpitz, which was the sister ship of the Bismarck, and St. Nazaire was the only harbour that was large enough to house it. The Allied forces obviously wanted to destroy the dock, but they wanted to force the Tirpitz out into open water so that they could have a chance to bomb her and destroy her. There was, as I said, had been an attack back in March 1942 where they'd done a lot of damage, but there was still a job to be done to destroy this harbour further. And in the RAF, the term for laying mines like this from a bomber aircraft was gardening, because the mines were sown like a gardener throwing seeds out or planting a garden. So the targets were all given names of trees and plants. So you maybe can't see this, but these are a few examples of the gardening names that were used. Would it say, yes, that's just more examples of the gardening names. Now this is loading the mines onto a Lancaster bomber. I couldn't get a Wellington loading mines, so I went with the next best thing, the Wellington. So, back at Binbrook, there were apparently only 3 operational Wellington's aircraft left. One of them was John's. So he and his crew were told to get ready for this flight to St. Nazaire. And their gardening name was Beach. So this was Operation Beach they were on. So John and his crew boarded their Wellingtons loaded with mines. Fuel for the aircraft was so scarce that there was a running joke that they'd have to empty out their cigarette lighters to get enough fuel to get these planes over to St. Nazaire and get them back. And so scarce was the fuel, they were actually told to land at Boscombe Downs on the way back to be refuelled to make sure they could get home. So at the 8th of October at 7 p.m, going out at night, John and his crew and 2 other aircraft from 12 Wellington took off from Wickenby Airfield, each with 2 bombs in the bomb bay. They set their course for St. Nazaire. The first crew was led by Sergeant Morfitt, and they returned at 1:51 a.m. and reported a successful mission. The second crew was led by Sergeant Whittle, and he returned safely home with his crew at 2:10. But as they waited through the night, there was no sign of Wellington BJ 780. There was no communication from Pilot Officer John Simpson or his crew. And it would only be much later through news from the Red Cross that his comrades in 12 Squadron would know what had happened to John and his crew on the 8th of October. So although John's bombing mission had been successful at St. Nazaire, everything had gone to plan, he was returning home over a very heavily armoured city called Lorient in Brittany. And his aircraft was hit by German flak from the 2nd Battery Flak 807, which was part of the anti-aircraft division of the Luftwaffe. So just that wee red dot will show you where John is. Lorient was a harbour city in Brittany and was an important German naval base for U-boats. It was highly fortified and defended. Just to give you an example, again, that's maybe too far to show you where it is over on the west coast, but that just shows you how well it was fortified here. The flak that hit John's Wellington bomber hit it in the port engine. It disabled his instruments, and part of his aircraft wing was destroyed as well. The aircraft was losing height very fast. They couldn't bail out because they were too low. There was nothing John could do but try and put the aircraft down as safely as possible to save his crew. So he switched on the aircraft belly lights to see where he was. He spotted a couple of houses with fields behind them, and he decided he would try and ditch the aircraft there. And again, I keep going back, 19-year-old lad making these life and death situations, these decisions. He told the crew to prepare for impact, and the plane came to a grinding halt in a field outside Lorient. John climbed out of the escape hatch in the roof and went to the back of the fuselage to see about the crew. He counted them as they climbed out, and Thomas Temple, who was the rear gunner, was missing. John went into the aircraft. He found Temple lying semi-conscious in it. Temple's gun turret had a direct hit from the flak, Part of it had blown away the turret and the guns, and the gunner had tried to move into the main part of the fuselage as John was landing. The impact had thrown him against the plane and it caught him in the stomach, so he was injured there. So John lifted him and dragged his injured colleague out of the plane. Now, as part of his training, John had been told in the event of a crash that they were to destroy their aircraft to prevent any technology or the aircraft itself getting into the hands of the German army. So John went back into the aircraft, he primed the incendiaries, ready to blow the plane, and raced back outside to his crew. But nothing happened. So he went back into the aircraft just to check about the incendiaries. And when he was in the aircraft, he remembered that he'd left his RAF cap up in the cabin. So he took it down, and then he heard some shouting outside. So he came out of the aircraft and found his crew with their hands in the air, surrounded by German soldiers. Now this is, that's just a photograph of the flak, the sort of thing that they were flying through. So this is an actual photograph of John and his crew being taken prisoner by the Luftwaffe, and that's John on the extreme left there. And the next three photographs are of John's damaged Wellington. So you'll see it's still intact in places because of that geodetic design, which probably saved their lives. And you can see the German officers are all over it, trying to see, what they can salvage, and so forth, how these planes were built. So almost 83 years to the day, John and his crew were taken prisoner. It was the 8th of October, so we're just nearly at that anniversary. They were put into transport, they were taken to a railway station where they boarded a train to Germany. And John's Royal School French came in handy because he talked to the Germans in French. Then he translated back into English, and back and forth they went. So there was German, French, and English going back and forward across the captives and the captors. The crew were interrogated at several locations, including Dulag Luft in Frankfurt. As part of their training, they had been instructed beforehand what to do if they were interrogated. We have no notes about what went on. John left no details understandably, about his interrogation. But then they were transported to Stalag Luft 3 prisoner of war camp in Sagen, which was about 90 miles east of Berlin. It is now called Sagen with a Z and is part of Poland. You may well be familiar with Stalag Luft 3 from the famous film, The Great Escape, and The Wooden Horse, which is another film. Stalag Luft 3 was a purpose-built camp for Allied airmen. There was only airmen in it, and it was guarded by Luftwaffe officers. This is part of the walk or the drive that John would have taken as he approached the camp. It was surrounded by a forest. And these are the sights that met John as he came into the compounds of the camp. The gun turrets there to guard them, the barbed wire, very bleak, no grass. This was to be John's home for the next 30 months until the camp was liberated. There were about 11,000 airmen in this camp at any one time, all from different nations across the world. And the camp had 4 compounds, east, north, south, and west. Each compound consisted of 15 single-storey huts, and a bunk room was about 10 feet by 12 feet, and that slept 15 men in 5 triple-deck bunks. So this would be a typical room in one of the compound huts. And we also have a photograph. Where did John go? No, we've lost him. Yes, this is a photograph of John, actually in the camp with a couple of his colleagues. Now, you can imagine the prisoners were not particularly well fed. So some of the men actually tried to do a little bit of gardening to supplement their food. But their meagre rations were also supplemented by these Red Cross parcels. These came regularly. There was food in them, and there was various bits and pieces for sports or other things that they might need. And these were vital to the survival of the men in the camp. The parcels contained 14 items of food. They were paid for at home here by a penny a week fund, and it really was to let the public help prisoners of war who were in the camps. And the prisoners' spiritual needs were also met. Some of the prisoners were captured chaplains. There was one man in particular called the Reverend Murdo Owen MacDonald, or as he was known, Padre Mac. He was from Harrison, Scotland, and he was a Church of Scotland minister and chaplain to the Queen's Own Cameroon Highlanders. He was wounded in North Africa and taken prisoner and did spend some time in Stalag Luft 3. The Young Men's Christian Association was also very active, and they organised volunteer chaplains to serve in various places. They supplied Bibles and hymn books to prisons and camps or hospitals, wherever they were needed. They were very active. Now, the airmen were also allowed to convert one hut in each compound into a makeshift theatre, and they put on plays throughout the year, anything from Shakespeare to pantomime. The seats of the theatre were made from the plywood from the Red Cross boxes that we've just seen, and this hut could hold about 250 people. And this is the foundations, they're still there at Stalag Luft 3 of one of the theatres. The camp had its own cricket club, but they had to play on hard earth. There was no grass there, and the balls were sent in one of those Red Cross boxes. John played for Ireland and enjoyed it. There was also a golf team, but they only had one golf club, and they had a homemade ball made from leather which burst about every 6 shots, so it had to be repaired as well. The American prisoners, they managed to get their hands on baseball bats and balls sent again through the Red Cross, and they would have arranged tournaments, and I'm sure the British prisoners had great crack watching the American soldiers playing baseball. They also would have had sports days, and they generally just tried to keep as active as they could. And I suppose it also the boredom in the camp, trying to keep themselves occupied. Now, John found his own fame because he invented a mouse trap that caught the mice that were eating their food. Because the Germans, when the Red Cross parcels would come in, it was mostly tins, and the Germans would punch the tins, pierce the top of them, so that they couldn't use them as an escape supply. They couldn't hide them away and then use them when they escaped. But of course, the mice would find their way to the hole in the top of the can, and John was sick and tired of finding mouse droppings. So he invented the mouse trap, which was so successful that it was sent round. He made several for all the compounds. Now, this might sound all a bit jolly hockey sticks here. You know, we're playing golf, we're playing cricket, we're having sports day, we're gardening and so forth. But this was no holiday camp for these men. They were surrounded by turreted machine guns, they had barbed wire, there were armed guards all around them, there were roll calls several times a day, and that was a punishment as well. If they did anything, the roll calls would come several times a day. Their food was rationed, their freedom had been taken away from them, and there were deaths from sickness and injury. And they were also frustrated because they were in this camp and they couldn't get back home to fight the enemy again. And they just lived from day to day with uncertainty about their future. The Germans were also very conscious that they were playing a very dangerous game in Stalag Luft 3 because they had put the most skilled and trained Allied airmen into one camp. And the Germans knew that at the forefront of all these guys' heads was the idea of escaping and getting home. The British airmen were particularly keen and thought it was their duty to escape. So to counteract any notions of escape, the Germans built the wooden huts off the ground, several feet off the ground, so that they could see if any tunnels were being built underneath. The camp was deliberately built on sandy subsoil, so difficult to shore up a tunnel, and any yellow sandy soil would be seen, if they were trying to dispose of it, it would be seen on the ground. There were microphones planted in the ground so that they could pick up any noise of tunnelling. But the airmen were crafty too, and of course all these guys had another life back at home. They were all professionals. So you have 11,000 airmen in one place who also have skills from engineering, tailoring, printing, plumbing, farming, accounting, building, photography, you name it, they had it in the camp. And John saw in the camp firsthand how ingenious people were at getting things because everything was so limited. So the nails were pulled out of the barrack walls. The angle brackets on the corner of the huts were used as hammers, or prangers as they called them. The camp also had some of the best forgers who could turn out German documents. They had skilled tailors who could turn RAF uniforms into double-breasted suits. They stole wire from the searchlight power lines. They turned powdered milk containers into lamps. They took the wooden boards from their beds and shored up the tunnels with those. They had hinges, bits of old metal buckets, hammers, jemmies, anything that they could use as a tool. The wooden Red Cross boxes that we talked about earlier were broken up and used for many, many purposes. Engineers built radios out of anything they could lay their hands on, and the men would listen to the BBC World Service in secret. And some electrical hardware was actually smuggled in. So this is a radio hidden inside a cribbage board for one of the American compounds. Now, one of the most famous escapes from Stalag Luft 3 was planned by squadron leader Roger Bushell. And he wanted to excavate 3 tunnels with the idea that if 1 or 2 of them were discovered, they would still have a third that they could use. Now, he didn't think small because the escape plan was to help 200 men escape in one go, dressed in civilian clothes, forged papers, and all the escape equipment they need. So this is a major plan. The 3 tunnels were codenamed Tom, Dick and Harry, so that if the German guards overheard anybody talking about Tom, Dick or Harry, they would think it was one of the prisoners they were talking about. And they were forbidden to say the word tunnel. And anybody who mentioned the word tunnel could be court-martialed. They always had to call them Tom, Dick and Harry. So here we have just a diagram of the complexity of this plan that was being put in place to dig these tunnels. The tunnels were only 2 feet square. They were very cramped and difficult to shore up because of the sandy soil. And there were over 600 men involved in the camp, involved in these tunnels, and John was one of them. And he was keen to help, as he thought it was his duty to escape, even if that meant giving up the boards of his bed to support the walls of the tunnel. Now, John was very friendly with one of the Canadians in Hut 104, which was one of the tunnel entrances. It went down 40 feet, and John would regularly go there to see if he could help. That's the hut where Harry was. So John was never allowed to dig the tunnel, but he operated the air pump, as we see here. And he helped to get rid of the sand and the soil that was being excavated. Now, they disposed of the sand and the soil by making bags from anything they could lay their hands on. Now, from the description, I have made as best I can what I think is the same sort of contraption. So it was 2 bags. Now, this is not, and it said on a 4 feet length, but this is not 4 feet. And they put this round their necks, under their uniforms. The bags went under their trousers. They were filled with soil and sand. They would go out into the parade ground outside, and they would put their hands in their pockets, and there was some sort of mechanism in these bags. As they walked along, they shook their legs, and the sand and the soil went out all over the parade ground. So, ingenious or what? Probably not the most comfortable thing, but brilliant idea. And that was one of the jobs John did. Now, unfortunately, Tunnel Tom was discovered in Hut 123 and was dynamited by the Germans. Tunnel Dick was in Hut 122, and that was abandoned because they discovered that where they were coming up was actually an area where the Germans were going to expand the camp. So the Germans were going to be working there, so they had to let that go. But Tunnel Harry was under a stove in Hut 104. It was dug under the German administrative area, how daring's that, under the sick hut and under the isolation cells, and it emerged in the forest on the northern edge of the camp. When it was completed and ready to go, the big escape was planned for the 24th and 25th of March 1944. It was initially a success, but it didn't end well. 76 men successfully escaped through Harry, but the 77th man was discovered by the German guards. Only 3 managed to escape the camp completely, and of the 76 that escaped, 73 were recaptured. When news of the escape came to Hitler's ears, he was furious. But his second in command warned him if he took reprisals, if he killed all the men that were captured, then there might be reprisals against German pilots who were prisoners in Britain and so forth. So he reduced the number, but not by very much, and 50 of the escapees were executed by the Gestapo, which was a terrible blow to the prisoners in the camp. Just they'd worked so hard for this. 17 of the captured escapees were returned to Stalag Luft 3, 2 were sent to Colditz Castle, and 4 were sent to a concentration camp. And the camp commander, the German camp commander, was also court-martialed and exiled because he had allowed this to happen. The 3 men who managed to escape were Per Bergland from Norway, Jens Müller from Norway, who both managed to reach Sweden, and Bram van der Stok from Holland, who managed to make his way to Spain, helped by the French resistance. Now this is the size of the tunnel. This is a German officer in the tunnel, so it just shows you how cramped it was and the working conditions that they were in. And then this is a memorial. If you go to Stalag Luft today, these memorials are there close to the exit of Harry, and they now stand as memorials to the men who were executed. Now, another mode of escape from the east compound was the wooden horse. And for those who might not be familiar with the story, the wooden horse was built in the prisoner of war camp on the pretext that the men wanted to do daily exercise. And the horse, this is a replica of the actual vaulting horse. It was placed beside the perimeter fence. The men would go out and exercise and vault over it. I'm sure they don't do this in school anymore. I seem to remember that back in my school days. And there's a bit of a thump as you go over the vault there. So the noise of the men exercising, there was actually a tunnel under the vault, and the men were digging away as the other men were vaulting over the horse. Eric Williams, Michael Cordner, and Oliver Philpott all managed to escape with forged documents and civilian clothes, and eventually made their way back to England. So this was a successful one. Now, for anybody who's seen the film The Great Escape, you will know there's a scene in it with Steve McQueen jumping a fence on what do we call it, a Triumph TR6 motorbike. And just to assure you, nothing like that ever happened in Stalag Luft 3. It was a total Hollywood fantasy. McQueen was a huge film star. He was obsessed with motorbikes, and the only way he would do the film was if they included a motorbike scene in it. So it just didn't happen. Now, this is a photograph of John and his father before he was captured. He came home on leave. And John's father sadly passed away in 1944 when John was still in the camp. So father and son never got to meet again. John found out about his father's death when he received a letter in the camp from Barney Cartledge, who was a former Royal School teacher, and telling him how marvellous his father was, how such a good friend he had been. So John just took from the letter that his father had died. And then about 2 weeks later, John got a letter from his mum actually telling him his father had died, and that she was now running the newspaper as best she could. So a sad time for John in the camp as well. But on a more positive note, John was still considered to be on active service, as all prisoners were. And on the 4th of April, he was promoted to flight lieutenant. Now, I don't know whether he knew or not that he moved from pilot officer to flight lieutenant, but he was. So while John and his fellow airmen remained in the camp, the war in Europe and the Middle and the Far East was raging on outside. But the Allied armies were making great advances following Operation Overlord on the 6th of June with the D-Day landings as we now know them. The Soviet Union was also making headway, and in January 1945 they crossed the German border and they were advancing through Poland. They were about 100 miles away from Berlin, so getting very close. There were Allied bombs dropping close to the camp, to Stalag Luft, so the airmen actually had to dig trenches in case a bomb made a direct hit on the camp. And the Germans realised they were about to be overrun by the Soviets, and they needed to take action now. So they decided to evacuate the camp. So while there was optimism among the Allied forces in the camp that their colleagues were coming, they were on their way, it was also a very anxious time for the prisoners because they had no idea what the German officers would do when they were now threatened by the Allies being so close. Oh yeah, there's Steve McQueen and his famous motorbike. So John and his fellow prisoners soon found out. January 1945, in the bitter cold and snow, John and his friends from Britain, America, Canada, Australia, Poland, Norway, they were all marched out of camp at night. And fresh in their minds was the execution of those 50 men by the Gestapo. They're probably very anxious. They've been marched out into the middle of a forest, probably very anxious about what was going to happen, whether they were going to survive this. They'd come so far. Could they keep going? But they were forced then to walk over 100 miles in freezing conditions in a walk that is known as the Long March. They had inadequate uniforms, they had no shelter and very little food. The men arrived at a camp. This is just an image from the Long March. There's not very good images from it, but this is just an idea of some of the men, and this as well, trying to get some sleep. So the men finally arrived at a camp called Marlag and Millag Nord in Tarmstedt in Germany. And it was in a very bad state because there had been Royal Navy prisoners there. They had been moved out of it, but they thought the German army were moving in, so they destroyed the camp, more or less. The Stalag Luftmen came into the camp. There were broken windows, broken beds. The mattresses were full of lice. They smashed stones. And of course, the weather was bitterly cold and wet, but they had to stay in this camp for 3 months. After 3 months, they were again forced to march eastwards towards a camp that I think was called, or near Lübeck in Germany. But the Allied forces were advancing very quickly, which brought great anticipation to the Allied forces, but again a dangerous time for the prisoners because they were being caught between the Germans retreating, the Allied forces coming the other way towards them, and bombing overhead and so forth. So they weren't in a great spot. And as the troops came closer to Lübeck, the German guards knew that their game was up. The Third Reich was beaten, and they laid down their weapons and fled, just left the prisoners, although many of the Germans were captured as prisoners themselves. And John and his fellow prisoners were finally liberated just outside Lübeck by the Fife and Forfar Regiment. Now, by sheer coincidence, the Fife and Forfar Regiment were an armoured yeomanry regiment from Fife in Scotland. The regiment had been stationed here in Dungannon at the start of the war. They often used the John Street Hall that I was talking about earlier. They came to special services in here, organised by the Reverend Stanley Thompson. So John knew a lot of the guys from the Fife and Forfar. They recognised him and he recognised them. They chatted away about Dungannon, the various places around here, and all the friends they knew in the area, which is unbelievable. Such a small world. So John then found an abandoned car and he managed to get it going. So he set off with a fellow prisoner called Squadron Leader Grant. They arrived at Celle Air Force Base in France, and they were flown to Eindhoven, where they boarded a Lancaster heading to Bryce Norton. The pilot of the Lancaster allowed John to fly part of the way, so he finally got to fly his promised Lancaster home. On the return, John and his fellow prisoners had to fill in a prisoner of war questionnaire, and part of this was really to hold the Germans accountable for any mistreatment that they had done or so forth. So, yes, that's the Lancaster that John finally got to fly. This is a part of the questionnaire that they can fill in. You probably can't. It is quite hard to read. But they were asked were they mistreated or with any medical reasons or injured in any way. And John actually answered no to most of them there. That's page 2. Were you lectured in the event of being captured? John said yes, in Binsbrook in 1942. And question 3, have you any matters that you wish to bring to our notice? And John said no. So he probably just wanted home, I would imagine. So from Bryce Norton, John returned home to Dungannon via Larne ferry. He arrived in Dungannon on VE Day on the 8th of May, which was also his sister Sheila's birthday. What a birthday present. And he was ferried home in a taxi, some of you will know, by Kenny Stewart's father, Sammy Stewart. And when he arrived, he was very thin and gaunt, and his family said he weighed about 5 stone when he came home. John also had to pay a visit to the barber, to William Courtney, as his hair hadn't been cut in 4 months. He joined in with the formal VE Day celebrations, which took place in Dungannon a few days after his return. And he was invited to join all the dignitaries of the town. Now, I read on the roof of the air raid shelter, I'm not sure where that was, and Dungannon Silver Band played appropriate music, so I approve of that. That's great. So John was eventually demobbed from the RAF in January 46. And on his return, of course, he immediately went to help his mother run the Tyrone Courier newspaper. And he remained there until his retirement. Now, in 1946, he married Margaret Shields, who was the daughter of Mr. and Mrs. James Shields of Roan Hill House at Grange, and they were married here at Dungannon Presbyterian Church. So they stood here where we are. And actually, on the way in, Phyllis Williamson told me this poppy arrangement, these poppies were donated to the church by Margaret Simpson. I didn't know that. What a coincidence. So there's wee links all over the place. This is the old Tyrone Courier office, as you would know it, now just sitting in ruins. And Margaret and John on their wedding day. And the other side is a napkin ring. There was a set of them given to them from the staff of the Tyrone Courier. And this is Margaret, a beautiful lady. She also contributed to the war effort as a member of the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, which was one of the sectors in the RAF. And she was a plane plotter in Middle Wallop in Wiltshire, which was again an important RAF base, very much involved in the Battle of Britain. The plotters were usually women. They worked in teams to track the aircraft and took information from radar and from observer corps. And Margaret said she never actually tracked John, but she usually knew where he was in the air. She had a fair idea. This is the Shields family here. This is Margaret's family, and all of them served in the armed forces except Olive, who was too young. James was in the RAF and Eric was in the Royal Navy. And John and Margaret went on to have 4 children. Derek, who sadly has passed away about 4 years ago. Peter, who took over the Tyrone Courier. A daughter, Sally, and son Jonathan. And Sally actually sent me a lovely message this afternoon just to wish us all the best for tonight, and said she was extremely proud that her father was being honoured, that he was a lovely daddy, and she hoped she could get a recording of this. So after many years as a proprietor of the Tyrone Courier, John retired to Island Magee round Larne. And his son Peter took over the paper and the printing works, and it was eventually sold in the 1980s, and Peter retired to England. This is a picture of John's logbook, which Sally has kept. She just sent me a photograph. And this page shows the very last entry that John made before his crash landing. John's uniform and his medals were sent to an RAF museum in London. I don't know exactly where. So, like so many 18-year-olds, in 1939, John answered the call to defend his country. And while he returned to his family safely, it undoubtedly left a mark on his future. And at the age of 23, John had seen more than most in a lifetime. Sadly, John died on the 20th of February 2006 and is buried here in Dungannon in Cool Hill Cemetery. Pardon me. We can only be thankful for his sacrifice and the sacrifice of so many like him. Perhaps the next time when we look over at our memorial and you could spot a few names. So there's James Shields, Margaret Shields, Eric Shields, and John Charles William Simpson, all on the memorial over here. We will know the story behind them. And just to come back to the photographs of the crashed Wellington. This is John's actual Wellington that crashed. And I wondered how these photographs came into existence, because there would have been no instant TV and radio at that time. There's no TikTok, no Facebook. where everything's just in an instant. So I did a wee bit of digging to see where these photographs came out of. The German Luftwaffe officer who shot down John's plane made his way to the crash site and took the photographs as a souvenir of his accomplishment that night. The Luftwaffe officer survived the war. He went home to Germany. The photographs lay undisturbed in his attic, in his house, until his death in 1980, when his wife was clearing out the house and clearing out the attic, and she came across them. She forwarded them to the RAF in London. The RAF could identify the plane. I don't know whether you can see it there. Yes, you can see clearly the number BJ780. So they could track this plane. They published the photographs in the RAF News. And one day in 1981, John was reading his latest edition of RAF News. He turned the page, and there he was, the photographs of his crashed Wellington and him and his crew being taken prisoner. Isn't it just phenomenal how the two men, a German officer and pilot officer Simpson, were joined again together, both men from opposing sides, and after the war, they kind of found each other again. Now, so just in closing, I want to thank a few people for making this evening possible. And as usual, it just takes a team of people to make events like this happen. Firstly, thank you so much for coming along this evening. I am just astounded by the crowd that is here. Thank you for your support this evening. It means a lot. Thanks also to the family of John Simpson. Like so many servicemen, John did not talk about his war experiences, but they shouldn't be forgotten. And it's only through family photographs and artefacts and newspapers that the experiences of these men and women can be all put back together again. And I'm very grateful to the Simpson family, especially John's son Peter and his daughter Sally, for their very kind and generous sharing of information about their father, their mother, and the wider family circle. Unfortunately, Peter is on holiday at the moment. He does hope to get over to the Sacrifice Remembered exhibition, and Sally was unable to come this evening, but sends her very best wishes. Thanks also to Alan Shields for sharing his family history, to the invaluable work of John Hewitt in his book Aviators of Ireland in World War II, to Stephen McMullen up on the desk here for all the sound and light and everything that's going. Thank you, Stephen, for all your help and advice. To those who helped prepare the church for this evening, especially in the midst of all these renovations that are going on. There's white dust everywhere. Thanks to Julie Williamson and her team who, as we speak, are making the tea. Thank you there. To Rochelle McMullen, who I just see here to my right, who is our chief organiser for Sacrifice Remembered in November, and we hope you'll all come back for that exhibition. Rochelle has put an awful lot of work into that. There is a small exhibition through the Rogers room. The supper is in the coffee room here. There's a small exhibition, and thank you to everybody who provided items for that. I know some of them are very rare and very valuable, so thank you for trusting us with them. Thank you to my family for their help and patiently listening to this story over many months as it unfolded, and will you hear what I found? But thanks also to my brother Trevor Blakely for helping with this evening. It's just always a phone call away, and thank him for that. And at last, just to the Kirk session and the committee of the church for allowing us to hold this event, and particularly to hold it in the church. Thank you.
Now, there is supper, and I hope that you will stay for supper. It's just out through the doors here and across to the right, and then the Rogers room is straight across the corridor, and you'll be tramping through the white dust, but I'm sorry, I can do nothing about that. Your car mats will all be covered in white dust when you go home. But do take a look at the displays. We've actually managed to get, thanks to Tony and Johnny, who got us an exact replica of a flight lieutenant's uniform that John Simpson, if you compare the photograph with the uniform, it's fabulous just to see it in reality, so thank you. You can take your tea there, you can take your tea into the Rogers room and just get a comfy seat, relax, have a chat and enjoy the rest of the evening. If you would like to wander around the church here and look at the memorials, please feel free to do so, and I'm sure anybody will help you with any advice. And just to give a little bit of advance notice, David Cuddy is doing a talk on the Royal British Legion and the Commonwealth War Graves on the 10th of October at 7:30 in Dungannon Presbyterian, back here again, 10th of October. And then, of course, our big weekend, Sacrifice Remembered, in November. So we hope that you will all support that. And there's plenty of leaflets, so if you think there's anywhere you can distribute these, please take them. But thank you all so very much for listening. Thank you.
Well, there's somebody that Valerie obviously forgot to thank, and that was herself. So, Valerie, on behalf of the church, I just want to thank you very much for all of your work and effort that you have presented into this evening. Thank you all very much for coming along to support this event. We just are so thankful that people want to come along and hear the story of the wars and just maybe to appreciate a little bit more about what people actually did go through. So we thank Valerie. I just wanted to mention Valerie's family by name: David, Gary, Matthew and Richard. And I don't know whether I've got them in the right order or not.
Oh, well, I'm not care.
And Valerie's brother Trevor. They have been a tremendous support to Valerie in preparing for this. There was a few of us around yesterday afternoon, and Gary was in, and they were putting up music tonight, and they just do it in their lovely, quiet manner. So thank you all for the lovely work that they do to support their mum and their wife. Thank you. Just from the church as well, can we just thank Julie Williamson for all the work that she has done in preparing for the supper, and the band of people who provided food and are helping to serve. Thank you to Stephen for the IT, and also thank you to Phyllis Williamson for the beautiful floral display tonight. As Valerie was saying, from Margaret, the poppies were donated from Margaret Simpson years ago. So it is lovely, and thank you, Phyllis, for doing that. We have three gentlemen here from County Fermanagh who have come up this evening, and a local chap as well, Desi. So thank you for coming up and for letting us borrow the Flight Lieutenant uniform. It just is lovely. Have a look at it. It is an original uniform. Do have a look at it into the Rogers room. But this is a very busy time for Dungannon Presbyterian Church at the moment, for the life and witness of our church. Moygashel Hall is celebrating its platinum anniversary of 70 years of Christian witness in the village of Moygashel and wider afield. There's a series of events that have been put together to celebrate this. There's a little leaflet on the hallway, so please do lift that. There's a series of events on the back of it, and please do come along and support as many of these events as you can, just for the lovely work that they do in Moygashel. As Valerie has also said, David Cuddy is also doing the talk on Friday the 10th of October, so please do come along to that, and then to our Sacrifice Remembered Poppy Festival on the Remembrance Weekend, the 7th to the 9th of November. So I'd like to ask May to come forward now. May Miller, as many of you know, is the wife of our Clerk of Session, David Miller, who's been clerk for many years, and we'd like to present Valerie with this bunch of flowers. And again, thank you to Phyllis for putting them together. Not a problem.
I forgot to thank Harry. Thank you so much, Harry, for your help tonight.
So we do apologise for the dust that's out in the hallway. We are undergoing renovations. Any donation that can be received this evening will go towards renovating here in town, and also whenever we start the next phase in Moygashel Hall. As you know, these older buildings, they take upkeep, so any donation would be greatly received. And there's also gift aid envelopes for anybody who's a taxpayer, because that also does help as well. So if you want to do that. But no, thank you very much, Valerie, for everything that you have done in preparing tonight. So if we could just bow our heads and give thanks for our supper, and please do go through. There's also extra seats set in the main hall, because we weren't just maybe expecting just quite so many. Okay, so loving God, we thank you for the gift of this food, for the hands that have prepared it, and for the fellowship we share. As we have heard this evening about the life of John Simpson, may his story inspire us to live with gratitude, to serve one another with love, and to seek peace in our world. Bless this food to our bodies and our time together to your glory. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. Okay, thank you very much, and do enjoy your cup of tea.